r/AskReddit. What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants, to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral, because doctors had removed her legs, and didn't want her to find out. Is anyone else ridiculously disturbed that they named that Project Sunshine? What the fuck? The German radar guidance system Wotan was a great example on why your project/operation names should have nothing to do with their content. Eli 5? During WW2 the British gained some intelligence referring to a new radar system called Wygerad, also known as Wotan. Wotan being a single-eyed mythical god, engineers were able to figure out what the system was and how it worked based on it using a single beam, one eye. Good thing the USA didn't call it Project Dead Kid Limb then, eh? Yeah, the actual Project Dead Kid Limb is for something totally different. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession, a couple of 100 pages of pure madness. Necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them. A lot of it in a pretty candid, offhand manner. Dahmer should have been prosecuted for what he did in the army. Source. For Capshaw, it began the day he and Dahmer, an army medic, were put into a room together. The assaults began at once and, eventually, he leapt from the third-floor window to escape. I had probably been raped 8 to 10 times, I don't know. He was tying me to the bunk with motor pool rope. He took all my clothing from me. He would either beat me before he raped me or he would beat me after. Jesus fucking Christ. How does that go unpunished? Probably the same way that sexual assaults go unpunished in the military, even though it's pushing 20% in the Marines. And that's mild compared to the Air Force. Edit. After convening with members from other branches, it appears that every branch of the military reports numbers of occurrences. But will fudge the numbers of another branch, in order to point the finger and make themselves look better. After the Lai Massacre, killing of around 400 to 500 innocent civilians in Vietnam after an army troop killed an entire village, the US government established a group to investigate other war crimes like this occurring in Vietnam, the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group. They found 28 massacres of equal or greater magnitude than My Lai that the public was unaware of, so literally thousands of innocent people killed by U.S. soldiers. The information has since been reclassified, but there were several journal articles on it when it was first released. I took a military ethics class hosted by a prof who spent many years in Vietnam as a Marine captain. He personally experienced a colonel who operated with a doctrine called count the meat. Basically, the success of an operation was dependent upon how many bodies it made. The presumption was that they were all enemies. The sad thing is that is how the Vietnam War worked. America was operating on a strategy of attempting to kill as many VC and NVA as possible, rather than to secure ground and capture territory like in previous wars. Working under the assumption that if they killed them all, there wouldn't be an insurgency anymore. You're absolutely right, but remember too that up to that point, America had never fought a real insurgency. There have only ever been a few winning counterinsurgencies won by a Western country. Several of those, such as the Second, I think, Boer War, involved mass concentration camps of non-combatants. If you aren't going to do barbaric shit like that, you have to get the people to turn against the insurgents. I believe the UK fought the only 2 successful counterinsurgencies in modern times. That strategy is probably not going to work well when your draftees are massacring villages. Edit. Should have specified I was focusing on America post WW2. Thanks to everyone that taught me new things, especially details about the Philippine-American War. Yeah, the UK, and rearmed Japanese soldiers, amazingly, actually had a very successful campaign against what would later form the VC and such just after WW2, but were recalled before they could finish it. By the time America enters the war, they are far more restricted than the Brits at the time and so rely on this attrition warfare to win. Operation Midnight Climax. The government hired sex workers to dose Johns with LSD for research purposes, so to speak. Midnight Climax sounds like a porno. It basically was. Threat level midnight. Jump to the right and shake a hand, jump to the left and you shake that hand, meet new friends, tie some yarn, that's how ya do the scarn. Blurring the line between comedy and insanity. CIA involvement in starting the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted 36 years and led to the genocide of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. Whoopsie daisy. Very big whoopsie. A whole bouquet of whoopsie daisies. And set up the country for the shit show that is Guatemala today. Just like Nicaragua. Guatemala is a beautiful country and the people are also beautiful, but, as one taxi driver said to me, 25 families own everything in the country. Corruption is rife and the destabilization caused by the involvement of the US has been devastating for the country and its people. I watched from my hotel balcony as people came to the lake to bathe and wash their clothes. And now we deny people asylum from the mess we created, and tell them they should stay and fix their problems at home. One US bomber accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb a short distance from a major US city, can't remember which, but luckily it didn't detonate. Off the coast of Georgia. They still haven't found it? No, they know exactly where it is, it would just be more dangerous to retrieve it than to just leave it alone. It's off the coast of Savannah. Fallout 5 in Savannah confirmed. Let's start it. Good idea, Pussy Blaster 69420. My hometown was littered with radioactive waste by the federal government as part of the Manhattan Project. Then we wonder why cancer and thyroid conditions there are the norm. I grew up 2 miles from the LOOW, Lake Ontario Ordnance Works, site, and my dad grew up on 89th Street in Niagara Falls in the 40s. He says that he remembers sitting on the train tracks as a kid watching the Hooker chemical trucks bring in 55-gal drums to the Love Canal. That whole area was contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff. So what did they do? They bulldozed it over and built houses on it, of course. Then in the 70s, when people were noticing toxic sludge in their basements, kids' feet were being literally burned by the high levels of phosphorus in the ground, and people were getting sick, they acted like they knew nothing. Eventually people sued and the whole area was evacuated. They tried to clean it up, but they basically put tons of dirt and clay over the area as a cap, and it's all fenced off. You can see it when you drive east on the Niagara Falls Expressway to Towanda. For the Lewiston storage site, also known as the NFSS Niagara Falls storage site, I've read documents where they had hazardous storage barrels sitting exposed to the elements, with seepage and all that. Again, they've covered everything with clay to stop it, but it's already in the ground. The bad thing is that there's a large elementary and high school, Lewiston Porter, about 2 miles from the site, which is actually on property that used to be part of the site but was never used and was sold to the county. Needless to say, the cancer rate among long-term staff and teachers is higher than average. I'm glad to have finally moved away. Military waste is way worse than civilian waste and comes from an era of reduced safeguards. Pretty much any site involved with early bomb development should be a Superfund site and should be retained indefinitely by the government. Military lax regulations for environmental impact isn't limited by nuclear either. Groom Lake aka Area 51 is purported to be extremely toxic due to various chemical leaks and dumps and testing around the lake. The Department of Health and Human Services practiced female sterilization on Native American women all the way through the 1970s. Kinda sobering knowing that we were using tax dollars to suppress indigenous birth rates less than 50 years ago. I think even recently in Manitoba there's been reports of hospital staff telling local Indigenous women who'd just given birth that they aren't allowed to see their babies unless they consent to sterilization. First Nations are still incredibly vulnerable, and the West is still feeling aftershocks of genocide. It happened in 2018. This was so prevalent that between 25 to 50% of Native women were sterilized against their will, and their birth rate dropped by 3/4 following this time. Black and poor women too. I remember reading a story about a 12-year-old black girl in the South in the 60s going to the doctor for an appendectomy and leaving sterilized without being told. Many didn't find out for years, until they realized they should have gotten their period by now or were having trouble conceiving. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. Suspiciously, she always has a headache when I propose having sex. Possible capitalist plot. She's always volunteering to take the children to school on Mondays. Possibility of capitalist indoctrination of our children? Must interrogate them later. British Metropolitan Police Services have done exactly the same on ecological protesters from organisations like Greenpeace. There was literally a case a few years back, like 5 years ago, an undercover cop I believe married, and even had kids with a protester he was investigating the whole way through. And then he didn't have to pay child support 'cause he was on the job, and our government said they weren't liable either. Fucking joke. CIA invested millions in trying to make cat spies. $20 million to be precise. I don't know, the way my friend's cat is staring at me right now, maybe they succeeded. Don't worry, they were only able to successfully make one working spy cat, and it got run over by a truck shortly after deployment. The project was called Acoustic Kitty. Know why it didn't work? Test number 1, their very first spy cat ever ran into the street and was hit by a car. They decided to not continue. Bro, that's what they want you to think. Everyone knows cats have 9 lives. He faked his own death and is now in deep with his next assignment. It was the perfect plan. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against U.S. civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. My high school English teacher mandated that I read this. I didn't understand it at the time, but he was responding to my question I posed him. As an airborne vet, why do you seem so jaded in regards to US history and politics? Still one of my favorite teachers to this day, he and I were able to go into a lot other OST things the US has done. So it's completely feasible that 9/11 was a false flag operation. When people suggest the US did 9/11, I try to remind them that false flags can be simply letting a known plan happen without stopping it. As a part of the Army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into the pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs. They only actually got 10, and of those only a few were implanted. The ones which were would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the dope zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant when the controllers weren't present, the dogs who had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them that next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. If you want to read all about it and other things that the US and governments around the world are up to from the horse's mouth, I highly recommend the blackvault.com, the website of /u/blackvault. Here's 100-ish pages of what I described above, helpfully FOI'd and archived thanks to his hard work. Edit for some bright side, via the same source we get remote control of war dogs, remotely controlled scout dog, June 1974, wherein we learn that we can, just train dogs. They respond to audio and visual cues, and can be trained to turn on command at long distances by playing a tone over the radio. The dogs were destroyed. This isn't any different than what happens to animals in experiments today, sadly. They cut them open and look inside to make sure they are okay. Were the destroyed dogs okay? My previous answer to another post. Not sure if this has been mentioned or not, I'm not scrolling through a million replies. The site is run by a guy named John Greenewald, u/Blackvault, started putting in FOIA requests when he was 15 and never stopped. Currently has what is arguably the largest privately owned collection of declassified information from the US government anywhere, and the entire archive is accessible for free. Not a direct answer to your question, but anything you want to know about stuff the US government was up to can be found buried in there, and he's taken the time to sort some of the more interesting stuff out to make browsing easier. Cheers. His Black Vault podcast is always a good listen even if you don't buy into the UFO stuff. He doesn't hesitate to point out the bullshit from anyone whether they are believers in this stuff or not, and gives a lot of time to skeptics to put their side of the argument, and treats everyone with respect. Not declassified documents, but the discovery of the Tuskegee syphilis study on unwitting black American males was pretty fucking horrific. The study was conducted without the benefit of patients' informed consent. Even worse, the subjects were under the impression that they were being treated, and if they tried to reach out for treatment elsewhere the research group would block them. I believe the original study was supposed to be shorter as well, but they lengthened it because they were curious about what syphilis does to the brain in the end stage of the disease. Basically they prevented treatment of black Americans until a treatable disease killed them, all in the name of flawed science. Oh, it gets even worse. Many of these men signed up for the armed forces, which gave vaccinations and treatment. One of the treatments was for syphilis. The government stepped in and stopped the army from treating them. Although originally projected to last 6 months, the study actually went on for 40 years. WTAF.